So, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this seminar series presentation for September 2023. And we've been running the ASCILITE webinar series all year. I think I'm biased, but I think quite successfully with people that have won awards or grants from ASCILITE in the last few years. In particular, people from the last year, from the 2022 ASCILITE conference. And so we're continuing that theme today with a presenter who I suspect needs little introduction, which is Associate Professor Jason M. Lodge from the University of Queensland, who's going to talk to us a little bit about his work that he's doing as part of an ASCILITE grant funded project that looks at self-regulated learning with technology. And he's doing this in collaboration with Jaclyn from Deakin University and Paula from Monash University. As I said before we started the recording, the only Queenslander in the mix. He's in the much sunnier part of the country as compared to his co-presenters, I suspect. But Jason is our presenter today, and Jaclyn and Paula aren't here, but I'm sure he'll tell you a little bit about them. Before we get into that, though, I'm going to do what I always do at the beginning of these presentations and just give you a little bit of color about ASCILITE. And before I do that, I'm going to, as always, acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on. One of the most really exciting things about our webinar series about ASCILITE is that we're talking about a very broad set of people here. So I'm in Queensland, as is Jason, but then of course ASCILITE members are across the country and indeed across Australasia as well. So when we acknowledge traditional custodians of all the land on which we meet and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, we're talking about a pretty wide set of people. And so as we go along, if you'd like to, it is entirely up to you. You can, and I can see somebody's done that already. You can type in the chat who the traditional owners are of the land that you are currently on. For my benefit, or for me, I'm in the middle of the Brisbane CBD at the moment, so that would be the Jagera and the Turrbal people here, but I live on the Gold Coast, so it's the Ugambeh people when I'm back down on the Gold Coast. So this little slide here tells you a little bit about ASCILITE. You probably know about ASCILITE. If you're here for this presentation, you probably know about ASCILITE and how it works, but you may find that there is something that ASCILITE does that you're not aware of. And so I always put up this slide to remind you about the various different things that ASCILITE does, including, of course, the webinar series, but as well as that, things like the community mentoring program, the tell-all blog, the conference, of course, which I'm going to mention in a minute, the special interest groups, and you might spot a special interest group on that list that you're really interested in. And I just saw, for example, Matthew Hillier dial into the room. He leads the e-assessment special interest group on that list. And then, of course, you might also know about our very exciting, very high profile journal, the Australasian Journal of Educational Technology. And Jason, for his sins, is also a lead editor of that journal as well, his Q1 journal. And I think #1 education journal in Australia as well, which is very exciting. So if you've got a paper that you want to publish in a journal, AZ is a good target. The only other thing I'm going to mention before I hand over to Jason is the conference, which I mentioned before. We're getting close. We're getting so excited about the conference. It is in Christchurch this year in New Zealand, and you'll know that that's getting really close. It is December 3rd until 6th, so less than 2 months to go. You can still register for the conference if you would like, and we would encourage you to do that. It's always a lot of fun to go to the conference. It is being hosted in this one, which I'll learn how to pronounce properly at some point, the Taipei Conference Center. I'm sure I'll work that out once I actually get there, how to pronounce it. But it's a very exciting, very interesting building, and as I understand it, is going to be a great conference, not only from a presentation point of view, but which we're currently working through papers that are being accepted for the conference, but as well as that from a social point of view for the welcome receptions and the conference dinner as well, which we're really looking forward to. But that's about it for me. That's my sort of introduction pluggy style slides. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our presenter. Now, as I said, he is a man that needs, I think, no introduction. He is the lead editor of AJET and, of course, a pretty well recognized expert professor in technology enhanced learning. In particular, Jason, recently have been talking a little bit about artificial intelligence and ChatGPT and generative AI. And I have seen Jason's model come up quite a few times when people are talking about generative AI and what we should do with it in higher education. But for today, he's going to talk to us about something a little bit different. He's going to talk to us about his project for ASCILITE. And so I'll hand over to Jason and put myself on mute, and he can tell us a little bit about that grant-funded project. Go for it, Jason.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everyone. I do have the chat open. If at any time anybody wants to chuck anything in there, I can see it. So please feel free to jump in at any point. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm coming from today, and that is I'm in Meanjin on the Maywar, or the Brown Snake, and I pay respects to ancestors and descendants who continue spiritual and cultural connection to country here. I would also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about that model that Mike just mentioned today. I will briefly touch on some issues around AI, though, because I think that they point to some of the critical data that we have collected as part of this project. I'm also going to talk more broadly about the work that Jaclyn, Paula, and myself are doing on trying to understand self-regulated learning. So I'm going to use the current context to slightly contextualize the work that we've been doing. And I also wanted to do that because part of this project has become about the way that students are interacting with various different technologies. And this year, a lot of that has been about generative AI. So they have told us about how they're using these tools relative to how they're doing other things to help regulate their learning. So I'm going to integrate all of that in together in the time that we've got. I wanted to start here. This is hot off the press. It's from Harvard Business School, so apparently we need to pay attention to these things. And it's work that Ethan Mollick has been involved in, and he's probably been one of the prominent voices around the world on artificial intelligence in higher education, particularly generative artificial intelligence. So he posted in his Substack on this over the weekend, and I thought there was something very interesting about the way that he characterized the work that he's doing with these colleagues. And the work was really trying to understand how generative AI is playing out in the kind of knowledge worker space. You can see from the title of the article there. So it's sort of focused on what's happening out in the world, but his take on this I thought was really interesting, given that a lot of what he's been talking about are the implications of this stuff for us in the higher education context. And he talked about this idea of centaurs and cyborgs, which I thought was an interesting way of framing it. And there was a lot in his post and in the article about this idea of being in a hybrid setup between us and machines. I think that's a really interesting idea, and it probably suggests where we're headed with all of this. And I promise I'm going to get to the bit about self-regulated learning and how it fits within all of this. But we're just going to step through this because I think it's important context for the work that we're doing and how it fits in. I have been thinking a lot about Inga Molinar's work in particular. She, last year, before all of the ChatGPT stuff started to happen, was talking about this continuum between the things that we're kind of happy to accept and the things that kind of go on in terms of, particularly in the education side. If we think about this, I don't want to talk too much about assessment, but if we think about the all human end of this, we're quite happy for our students to be doing that. That's what we've traditionally done. They do their activities. We get a sense of that. Voila, they get a degree, off they go. We're not happy with the other side of the situation where it's all AI. The great panic at the beginning of the year is that students would take assessment tasks, off they would run with those, put them into ChatGPT, spit them out and submit those. And, we're starting to see evidence that some students are doing that. The interesting bit, I think, is the bit in the middle, right? And I think that this idea, centaurs and cyborgs, is really about what that kind of hybrid relationship is in the middle. So my sense is that this post that Ethan made is really talking about this relationship where it becomes much more of a kind of both working together rather than more one, more the other, or one or the other. It's this messy space in the middle, I think is quite an interesting one to delve into. And he kind of captured the core of this. Well, they collaboratively did. This is one quote from the paper. We should move beyond this dichotomous decision about whether adapting AI or not. This means not just in terms of what we do in education, but what we're doing more broadly and what's happening, out in the world of work. But also we need to think then about what different configurations and combinations of humans and AI working together might look like. So it's almost as though there's this conversation happening in multiple places about a more sophisticated way of understanding what these relationships are and what they look like and how they might play out in future. I think from that for us, there are some pretty profound implications for what learning should look like in higher education to help prepare our students for a world in where this is the case. I should also mention that Mike Sharples was talking about this stuff months and months ago when I think we were still deeply embedded in this ban or not ban situation. And he was already talking about the possibilities for using generative AI as a Socratic opponent or a tutor or a motivational agent or a coach, all sorts of different possibilities that were out there. So credit where it's due. I think Mike was one of the first people to really go down this path and talk about all of these various different possibilities for this almost hybrid relationship. At the same time, I think it's fair to say, and I've heard this several times in the last couple of weeks, a lot of people are still saying, oh, this is just like calculators, right? This whole situation is very similar. We'll deal with it. We'll come up with new ways of operating and everything's going to be fine. I'm not so sure. And I think the more we go down the path of trying to understand this as a hybrid relationship between humans and machines, the less viable this analogy seems to me. Something that we've just had accepted for learning, research, and practice. This is some thinking that I've been doing with Sujing Yang, who was my PhD student, now postdoc, Leon Furs, and Phil Dawson, is that we've been trying to categorize and think about what do these relationships really look like. So if a calculator, for example, is some sort of cognitive offloading, we need to do some calculations, we need some help with that. We offload it to the machine, it does the calculations, gives us an answer back. What is AI in terms of all of the things in which people can do with it when we think about that kind of situation? It's not just about offloading things. It's not just about extending our capabilities. And in the paper, we've gone into some detail about how we see those things as different. So extended mind is the kind of Andy Clark and David Chalmers idea that we're using a technology to extend what our capabilities are rather than kind of offload. So we see those as different on that continuum there. But really, we're interested in this side of it. And I think it does capture, again, the sorts of ideas that Ethan Mollick and Inga Molinar and others have been talking about. So what does it mean when we co-regulate with a machine as a partner or a peer? What does this real hybrid situation look like? And how can we make sense of that and how students are navigating that space? So our question here is, what does it mean to collaborate with machines as a sort of peer type setup? Thankfully, there's a whole lot of work out there around human-computer interaction, which we can start to build on, and that's certainly something that we use as a foundation for the article that we've written together, is to sort of extend and think about the ways in which the human-computer interactions are really playing out with generative AI in particular. The other thing I think that I always go back to is that, we've been playing around with this kind of interface, although nowhere near as powerful, since ELIZA went live as much as you could go live in the 1960s. I think we've got a pretty solid foundation to understand this, but obviously new questions have been raised along the way. The other one I kind of like and always fall back to is, that I think there has been a lot of discussion about this idea of technologies being partners in learning and partners in thinking. This Salomon article way back from 1991 also started to kick around this idea. So what we wanted to do in this paper that we've just done is to try and draw these things together and think about what that relationship really is and how we can kind of start to categorize that and move forward with something that's a bit more sophisticated than simply saying, this is like a calculator, which is problematic. My nightmare scenario is that the relationship will look like this. And I don't think that's what we're seeing. And I'm going to come back to this, but certainly this was the way that Microsoft had deployed these kinds of technologies in the not too distant past. One interesting thing, part of this conversation at least, and way of cutting through it, which is going to bring us back to the self-regulated learning bit that Paula and Jaclyn and I are working on within all of this, is some discussions that I've had with Tim Fawns, who many of you will know. He's on holidays at the moment, so I know he's not here, about what is the right level of analysis for understanding all of this. And I think it is an interesting discussion to have. So Tim makes the point in this post that he put out a week or two ago that students were already using other things in their brains to do assessment. So the sort of panic that we've seen this year about how students might or might not use generative AI is really an extension of things that we've been grappling with for a long time. You know, we know that students have been using various different tools, whether they're Grammarly or spell check or calculators or Abacus or whatever. So it's a more sophisticated way of thinking about what that might look like. I have a question about agency. Does artificial intelligence have a sense of agency? Is it an agent in these situations in and of itself? Or is it enacting something where a person has provided their agency through the tool? I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to this question, but I know that, you know, people who come from the kind of more socio-material view of the world would say that tools like AI would certainly have agency. I think that's an open question for me. I want to park that for the time being, though, and get back to the key thing. Within any kind of network, and I think the data that we're gathering is suggesting that there is a complex network here, and I think that's where Tim and I probably agree. I would suggest that we want to try and understand the nodes within that network, how the connections in the network work, and the overall network. We want to try and understand all of this. So to put this another way, if we want to try and understand a forest, we also need to understand the trees. And in an understanding of those things together, we can then get a better picture of the overall sense of what we're looking at. So what we tend to do, Paula, Jaclyn, and myself come from a psychological perspective. Unashamedly, we tend to focus on the nodes or the students within all of this, but I don't think that that's any less important for our overall understanding of the thing. The risk with just focusing on the system or the network is that we might treat that system or network as a black box, right? And certainly in psychology, we've made many of those mistakes in the past. Skinner enters the chat. We do need to, I think, look at all of these aspects if we want to really understand what's going on here. So that is the way in which we've been thinking about these kinds of relationships, right? There are students involved in this. Students are individuals. They will make choices that work for them at a particular point in time. They have connections with others within the network. Those others might be their peers. Those others are increasingly machines that may or may not have some sort of agency themselves. So that, I think, is an important aspect of all of this if we're going to think about this as a hybrid relationship between students and technologies. Okay, so let's bring it back. I said I wasn't going to talk about assessment much. I will touch on it only briefly. Certainly there are others in the room who can absolutely contribute to that conversation as well. And I'm thinking about you, Matthew, here as well. Is the conversation we're having about assessment the right conversation that's needed at this point? And I think that is a question that Tim raised, and it's probably a really important question if we think about what this might look like in the longer term. So as far as the assessment piece goes, as many people here know, there has been the Assessment Experts Forum that we had about a month ago where we tried to nut all of this out. There is a document and a resource that you should see sometime in the next 10 days or so. And then we have a set of propositions in that document. Some of the people on this webinar have seen this and contributed and given us feedback on that, and it is greatly appreciated. We will talk about this more on the 28th. I'm sure many of you are aware that there will be another Texa and Cradle seminar where we're going to get into some detail. However, what I did want to say is that one of the key propositions that we've got is that we need to emphasize the learning process in all of this. So this discussion, I think, is a really, really critical one that we need to have, that is going to guide the future direction of what assessment will look like. And as a result of that, also about the things that we need to focus on when we talk about student learning in higher education. If we're increasingly in a world where it's about this hybrid relationship, then we've got to take that process of learning and that hybrid relationship seriously. Okay, so let's look at that learning piece. And now is this where we start to drill down into the self-regulated learning aspect of it. What should learning look like in the age of AI? Now, a lot of people say, well, it's about critical thinking, right? And anybody who went to Hertz and heard me talk about this will know where I'm going with this. But critical thinking is one of the things that we have said for a long time in our institutions is one of the main things that we do. Students come, they do a degree with us, and they, go out the other end, and here they are as critical thinkers. Beverly Oliver's great work, a decade ago, captured this beautifully, I think, in that if you look across all of the outcomes or graduate attributes or whatever it is that, your institution calls them, apart from, written and oral communication, which are obviously central, critical and analytical thinking is right there at the top. So we're all saying this is the thing. The commentary that I've seen in the last 9 months is, well, we've got to focus more on this thing now because generative AI does so many of the other things that we have been thinking are important. But is that the solution to all of this? Some other work that has run alongside of this is where we've looked at all of the ways in which we've tried to improve student critical thinking in higher education. We did a systematic review of this, got a whole lot of articles there. A lot of them didn't fit for various different reasons. Anybody who's done a systematic review will be familiar with this. It gets very messy, and not surprisingly, it's all over the place. So if we say on the one hand that critical thinking is the way that we're going to manage the new reality that we find ourselves in, critical thinking is a lot of things to a lot of different people, right? It's almost like student engagement where it's become amorphous and, everything to everyone, but nothing to anyone. We've used this as a way to try and pull this apart. I know that you can't see the detail there. That's not my point. There is a critical thinking matrix that my colleagues in the critical thinking project in the School of Philosophy at UQ have come up with. I think this is a really great way of teasing apart all of the different things that we think critical thinking is and the ways in which we go about trying to help students to develop all of these different types of attributes and skills. What I want to focus on here, which is the bit you will be able to see, is these 6 categories. And when I thought through this and looked at it closely, some of these things, generative artificial intelligence can at least simulate. Whether or not it's doing these things, of course, is a complete separate story here. But I think there are some aspects of this which generative AI can simulate quite well, and others which we still have the technology well and truly covered. And it's about even. Right? So I reckon we're about even Stevens on this. What I want to focus on, this is where we get to the punchline here, is that the things that the technology is not very good at simulating are things like evaluation and judgment, particularly things that require judgment in a human world. How are humans making sense of things? Machines not very good at being able to simulate some of those things. And self-regulated learning or co-regulated learning, as Tim has sort of argued, everything that's self-regulated is co-regulated. Paula disagrees very strongly with that there still needs to be a self within all of that. These things seem to be the things that are the differentiator at this point, based on our analysis of what generative AI can and cannot do. So although these often get lumped under the heading of critical thinking, they do tend to move more towards the idea of self-regulated learning because it's evaluation and judgment. It's increasingly about motivation and emotion, right? A machine doesn't know what it's like to have those things. It's a machine. It's spitting things out based on predictive algorithms. The other thing I think that's important in this is that when we think about something like evaluative judgment, which there seems to be, so my colleague Luke, who's not here, has been really delving into this. A lot of the things that sit under this are around subjective kind of judgments in the world, and generative AI just can't simulate that very well. Ernesto and Jaclyn have argued that, well, evaluative judgment really also aligns with the idea of self-regulated learning, this long established field and way of understanding how we learn how to learn. So a lot of this seems to be pointing to self-regulated learning being absolutely critical as a core skill, set of capabilities, set of attributes, whatever way you want to define it, from this point on in the way that we think about how we might help our students and what they need to do in the world. If you're not familiar with this area, I know I can see a few familiar names on the list of attendees here. Ernesto really tied together this field very well a few years back in this overview of the 6 models that are the most dominant ways of understanding self-regulated learning. So if you're not familiar with this, that's a really great place to start to think about what we mean by self-regulated learning and how it plays out. And I would suggest that if we're talking more and more about this middle section here, humans and machines working together in a hybrid kind of situation, one of the key capabilities in order to have a successful partnership or hybrid relationship there is that the humans really need to understand their own learning. So that's really core to all of this, we think anyway. And it's certainly starting to come through in the data that we're collecting. It also aligns with some of the conversations that are happening around the world. Sani Alvela, for example, has been talking a lot about this idea of a socially shared regulation or co-regulation with machines and humans and how that all comes together. Jaclyn, Paula and I also wrote about how we're having ongoing challenges in this space, particularly because of the amount of flexibility and online learning that we're doing coming out of the pandemic. So on the one hand, we've got generative AI and the evolution of those technologies pointing to the increased importance of aspects of self-regulated learning. On the other hand, we're seeing increased flexibility coming into what we offer to students through the pandemic and now increasingly after the pandemic. And that's challenging because in order to navigate increased flexibility well, we also need to be able to make good decisions about how to work through that flexibility. Right. So if we're putting more onus on students to make good decisions about their learning because they're doing more of it at home or in unstructured situations, they also need to be able to navigate that by making good judgments about how they're progressing and then thinking about what they need to do with that flexibility and decide how to spend their time well. Okay. All right. I can see that there's one small part of the conversation. Yep, Michelle. We continue to focus on it as a system. Yeah. So AI is forcing us to have a bit of a rethink of all that. Yeah, some good comments in there. Okay, so that's kind of the contextual piece to give you a sense about why we think this is important in this. And I think it's also helpful for understanding why we've collected the particular data that we've got and what that tells us about our current situation. So don't we already do this though? Right? Don't we already do a really good job of supporting self-regulated learning? Well, it's a complicated puzzle, as we're finding out. I want to draw together the work that we've done across a number of different studies. So this is work that Jaclyn, Paula, and myself have all been involved in. There's a huge effort that we've put into trying to understand this across a number of different institutions, across many, many students. We've looked at, I think, 3 million data points in all of this in total. We've collectively, including the work that my students are doing, 200 interviews or more. Part of this has been supported by ASCILITE, and we're very appreciative of that support. And there are 9 separate studies that we've done to try and get a sense of all of this. We've looked at data mining of enterprise systems. We're doing experience sampling. We've got a validated instrument, the SRLO instrument that we've come up with. We've looked at student evaluations, so student experience surveys and those sorts of things. We've carried out a whole lot of interviews, as you already just heard. And what we're trying to do here is get a sense of how self-regulated learning is playing out. A lot of this has been with first-year students because we're really interested in that transition to university. Part of the issue there is that in secondary settings, not all of them, but most of them around the country, we have a more structured system that has a heavy emphasis on external exams. That's certainly true in the Queensland context. When students arrive at university, we're doing more active learning, we're doing more blended, flipped, whatever we're calling it this week. But the bottom line is there is more flexibility that we're providing to students in higher ed. So that transition point is a really critical one to go from structured or increasingly structured to increasingly unstructured. So that's why we've tended to focus on that group. Here's what we're finding overall, and then I'm going to talk about the bit that is related to the ASCILITE project that we've been funded to do this year and what that data is telling us. So when we look at what students are doing, it's complicated. This is from Sujing's PhD project, and we looked at the way that group work dynamics played out in a single simulated assessment task. So this was in a room together, and this is a process mining map. But the key takeaway here is that there are complex regulatory behaviors going on there between the students towards the completion of the task. It's not a straightforward thing. There are all sorts of dynamics playing out in these situations. She looked at a whole lot of these kinds of scenarios, and it was a very similar story. It's not simple. So you can imagine once we add technology into the mix, it becomes even more complicated, not surprisingly. The other data that we've got that tells us about what students are doing, some of which is helpful and some of which is slightly disturbing, is the data that comes out of our learning management systems, for example. And this is something that has come out of my course, no identifying information in there. But some of the worrying things that we see that tell us something about self-regulated learning here is that you will see many students who don't access any material at all, despite the fact that you might say this is really important. We know that that's happening. We see other instances where students will watch the same video 48 or 50 times. What is that telling us about what the student is doing and how they're regulating their learning? It tells us something, but we don't know why they've done that. It could be that they've got it running in the background. It could be that they really don't understand something and they need to go over and over it. We don't know, right? But it does tell us something about what's happening with that regulation of their learning. What are they telling us? So that's what they're doing. What are they telling us? What they're telling us is that now this is quantitative data. It's messy. You can see that there are, quite big error bars there, but it was triangulated, at least by the interviews that we did with students. Many of them told us that they had trouble understanding how to make good sense of their progress. Right, so you can see again with that transition into first year in an unflexible environment, well, in a flexible environment, having come from a structured environment, that's going to be tricky, right? So they're telling us that they're having trouble monitoring their learning. They're also telling us, and this aligns with decades of research, that they need more flexibility, that they're increasingly trying to balance external factors like needing to work, right? We've got a cost of living crisis going on. They've got social things that they want to engage with. They need to work. They've got family commitments and other things going on. And a lot of students just don't see their core identity as being a student anymore, right? Their core identity is outside in various other ways, and they need to fit their studies within those things. Not surprising, given we've got decades of research suggesting that this has been a trend that's been coming for a long time, including the CSHE work that I've got on the screen there now. So that's what they're telling us. What we're seeing in terms of their behavior gives us some clues about what's going on there. How are they feeling about all of this? Well, many of them told us that they're struggling with aspects of negative emotion. Often this was anxiety about various different aspects of their study. But there were other things. They were feeling confused about certain things. They didn't know what to do when they were getting stuck, for example, because again, they've got a flexible system that they're navigating. More clues about what it means for their regulation of their own learning. Here's where it started to get interesting. Good question, Justin. So we're thinking about them more than just students. Well, they certainly seem to be seeing themselves that way. This, I can tell you some trends over a number of different institutions and a number of different discipline areas. What we started to see, and this was happening before the pandemic, but seemed to have accelerated during it, is that if you think about most first year units, you will tend to get this kind of bell curve of their achievement at the end of it. Here's the mark that they got overall. And, with a very, very large cohort, it's not surprising that you would see that sort of pattern under usual circumstances. But here's what started to happen. And I've seen this, as I said, across multiple institutions, across multiple discipline areas. Some students seem to be doing a lot better with the sorts of changes that we've been making over the last decade or so in particular. And these I'm mostly referring to more flexible options for their learning. This was the sort of course design where this pattern was starting to emerge, but quite a few students were dropping off. So instead of our normal distribution, we were seeing these bimodal distributions, which was really weird. The first time I saw it, I thought it was just an anomaly, something about that particular unit, but then I've started to see this pattern in multiple places since. What this suggests is that for the students who know what to do with the additional flexibility that we're giving them, they're thriving. They're really engaging with it for all the reasons that we talk about in terms of why active learning is great. Right? They're getting so much more out of those units of study. For students who don't know how to manage that flexibility so well, they're falling down because they haven't been given, the right kind of support they need to be able to make those good decisions about what they do with that flexibility. If this was a one-off, or there were only a couple of units or subjects that I saw this in, I thought, no, maybe that was an exception, but it's popping up all over the place. So, yeah, good point, Matthew. Yeah, there is a pedagogical piece in here that I'm sort of skirting around because that's the next part of the work that we're doing. Penny's question about secondary students dealing with flexibility. A certain type of flexibility, yes, but flexibility overall, I think largely not. And a lot of that comes down to the way in which they're assessed, because across most jurisdictions around the country, with the exception of the ACT, they still did. They were messy, but they still did these kind of high stakes exams. So it was really about teaching to the test. So a different kind of flexibility that we're talking about. So flexibility in terms of delivery mode, yes, but flexibility in terms of the way that the learning was operating and what they were being assessed or how they were being assessed, less so. But it's a good question. So why aren't we talking about this? Well, I think part of this has been sort of wrapped up into the broader conversation, which is often driven by the quilt, learner engagement, as useful or not useful as that term is. We've been talking a lot about belonging. We talk a lot about various other kinds of student support, which are around how do you write an essay? How do you reference? The mundane sort of day-to-day stuff, which is absolutely critical. And I think, certainly people that I work with in my institution are brilliant at supporting in students in those regards. I think we have done the right thing in focusing on belonging and making sure that we have the right student support in place. Again, absolutely critical. And I'm not saying that we should be doing anything instead of that. But the middle piece for me is the bit that seems to be missing. And that is, like I've been saying, how do we help students to navigate this additional flexibility that we've given to them? This has now also become increasingly critical because the minister has decided that we're going to be fined $18,000 for every time that we don't support students adequately. Right? And if we want students to succeed, I think we need to be focusing on the support around their studies, absolutely. The support for the nuts and bolts of how they do the things that they need to do in their study. But we also need to do that middle piece, which is helping them to navigate the flexibility that they now have in their studies. And that really is self-regulated learning. The data that we've got also supports that. But the kicker for me is a study that has come out of Charles Darwin University here, where they did 200 in-depth interviews with students who had dropped out. Now, part of the narrative here is true, and that's the ideas that we've had forever, which is that they do have competing priorities, they struggle financially, and all of those things are true in there. But what I thought was interesting in this study is that about a third of these students said that if they had had better support for them to learn how to learn, they may have made a different decision despite all of those other factors that they are needing to manage. And I thought that was a really interesting result here, because it partly supports the usual narrative we have around why students drop out. But a third of them are still saying if we had done a better job in supporting their learning, then maybe they may have made a different decision and not dropped out. So there is a core piece of all of this, I think, that is around self-regulated learning. So it seems to be one of the key skills we need to focus on, but at the same time, the way that students are engaging in self-regulated learning and the way in which we're supporting it is patchy. We could probably be doing a better job with that, I think is fair to say. All right, so within all of that data that we've got, what is the role of generative AI in all this, and what can we learn from the data that we've collected this year? And then hopefully we'll have time for a bit of a chat at the end of this. So this year, with the support of ASCILITE, thank you very much. And partly alongside of that, so we've done a little bit of work beyond what we were funded to do, is we've done interviews, we've done some experience sampling, we've got some other quantitative data, but I particularly want to focus on the interviews because they've been the really interesting bit and the bit that we've been able to pull apart more than the other bits at this stage. Mostly engineering and psychology students. We're about to start looking at education students as well. This is partly through convenience and partly because, we wanted to get a spread and ultimately we will get a spread. So the data that we've got that I've spoke about previously is across all disciplines, across all faculties. So it's a real mix of data. We wanted to focus on a specific group of students, first the engineering students, because we want to see how this interfaces with the kind of course design, well, in our place it's course, the kind of unit or subject design that students are experiencing and how that influences these processes as they play out. I want to go back to this idea of nodes, connections, and network, because I think we're getting some good data from these interviews that tells us about all three of these things. So here's what the node or the student, here's what the individual students are telling us about how they're navigating this space that they're in, where their regulation is partly through their peers, partly through the way in which they're increasingly interacting with technologies, but also the bit that is related to, the actual program of study that they're engaged in themselves. So let's start with the students. It's nothing like this. It's not anything that they're being pushed into doing. It's starting to feel a little bit more like the kind of thing that we mapped out in the paper that's coming out. And students are using a complex set of decisions to navigate their way through this. And what I mean by that is that with all of the options that they've got in front of them, including the technologies that they interact with, they very quickly figure out how to work their way through that and where the best place to go to support their learning at different times is. It's not the learning management system, and it's not their tutors or lecturers predominantly. The way in which they're doing that, which is the second piece in all of this, is that they are largely connecting through private chat forums. I think a lot of us knew that students were doing this. They're not doing it again through the learning management system. Most of the students that we've interviewed were actually using Instagram Messenger for this. So private chat groups. And most of them were telling us that they were involved in around 5, right? Some a bit less, some a bit more. So they had 5 distinct groups. Some of them were small groups where they'd met 2 or 3 others and that they were communicating in that small group. Others were across an entire first year cohort, which could be hundreds of students. That is one of the dominant ways that they're regulating their own study process, is that they will try and understand what's going on, partly by lurking and partly by being active through these private chat forums. And it's happening a lot. So most of the students we interviewed were in these forums many times a day, right? Some of them had them constantly open in the background and were, worried about the amount of notifications that they were getting from these, and that was becoming a bit over the top. So that seems to be a key part of the way that they're regulating their learning, is through these private chat forums. They do that in combination with the technology, right? So what many of them were telling us is that they weren't sure about something, so they'd work away on their own. So these periods where they get stuck for whatever reason are some of the most pivotal in this process for us to understand how this regulation is playing out. When they get stuck, if they are really, really not sure, generative AI will often be one of the first points where they'll try and get a better sense of what's going on. And again, the students we interviewed were talking about the way that they would use the chat function as a way of really delving into something. Then what they would do is take that and go to their peers. Right. So I've got a little bit of an understanding. I'm still not sure. I'm going to go to the private chat forum. I'm not sure enough to go to the big group. So I'm going to go to the small group first, but then I'll see how that aligns with the way that a big group might be thinking about something. All the while, those groups are also managing them towards timelines and those sorts of things. So people are posting, make sure that you've got this assessment task in mind because that's due next week. Or so the more mundane ways that they need to regulate their learning are also being driven a lot by these private chat forums. So what I think this suggests to us is that we've got some aspects of this that are around the individual decision making that the students are going through that is helping them to navigate this flexible environment that they find themselves in. Part of it is the way that they're then connecting with their peers. And then the third part, I think, is how that connection is working relative to the way that they're using the technologies. And then often many of them told us that the last point of call for them was to go to their tutors or teachers. Often a lot of them would talk about the things we've known forever. They find them intimidating, or they just don't see that they're particularly available, and so on. So I think this does speak to this notion of a complex network forming. What I think surprised us through this data is that this was happening very quickly, that students were figuring out how this was working and getting these peer groups set up all within the first couple of weeks of university. And a lot of it, at least the students that we've interviewed, and these have mostly been students at the University of Queensland, they have a very brief meeting face to face. And then immediately, one of the first topics of conversation is, have you got this? Where are you having this private conversation in this private chat forum? And they're away. So an interesting kind of development here, I think, where the technology and the way that they interact with their peers, it's moved out of our site, right? It's not happening on a discussion board. It's happening in these private forums, and students are quickly figuring out how to navigate these things. Are they doing it effectively? That's an open question. But it certainly helps to give us a sense of how this is playing out with this new technology in the mix. So we're starting to get some clues across these three different levels of analysis. And to us, we think that trying to understand all of this, the trees and the forest, is going to be important if we're going to do the right job in supporting students to regulate their learning through this complex network that they find themselves in. So what next? As I alluded to, the other part of this is how this interfaces with what we're asking them to do in unit or subject design. One of the next tasks for us as part of this project is to go back and to interview one of the course coordinators who was working with the students in the engineering program that we had most of this data from last semester. So now that we've got a sense of what they're doing, what we want to do is find out from the coordinator is, does this align or not align with what you thought that they were going to be doing in your particular subject unit course? And then from that, we can start to see where there might be, ways in that where that aligns and ways where that really doesn't align. So while they're regulating using this complex network that includes peers and technologies, we don't actually know whether that aligns with what the intention was, and then whether or not that's always going to end up in a positive outcome, or whether occasionally they might be being led astray. So that's the next piece of the work here. Okay, thank you to ASCILITE, who has been very supportive of this work. Obviously, Jaclyn and Paula, who couldn't be here but have been pivotal in all of this. The Learning Instruction and Technology Lab has also contributed to the broader data set that I've been talking about here in Italy, particularly Anisha, but certainly others. So the wonderful Anisha is the one who built and looked after the Course Insights tool that is the analytics tool that we use with our learning management system. So she's been enormously influential in all of this. And we have, as I said, are grateful for the funding from ASCILITE, but HERTSA, the Office of the DVCA in Italy, have also provided some funding towards this broader work. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Hopefully that was interesting and gives you a sense of the work that we've been doing and where we're headed with it and what it's telling us so far. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. We're going to give you a virtual round of applause. I saw Penny doing that already. If anyone else wants to give Jason a virtual round of applause, there you go, Jason. We've probably got a couple of minutes for questions, ladies and gentlemen. What we might do, there's a few of us here, so I might get you, now that you've found the applause button, to raise your hand for Jason, and he can field a question. And in the meantime, if there aren't any questions, I will be your envoy for anything you might want to type in the chat. But if there's anybody that just wants to ask a question directly, feel free to put your hand up. They were talking so much in the chat, Jason.
Yeah, no, I couldn't keep up. I couldn't keep up with it. I tried, but I couldn't keep up with it.
So Michelle had a question right at the very end, right? So she said, do you think, I'm going to paraphrase here, Michelle, sorry. She basically said, do you think that the quality of the course design was a driver for the students choosing to go outside to Instagram Messenger or whatever it might be? Was it about course design, or is it about something else for those students? What do you think they're making those choices?
It's probably a mix. So, and I mean, we don't have data that speaks to this directly yet. It's part of what we have planned to do in the future. My suspicion is that I think that there are certain digital habits, for want of a better word, that students are carrying over from the things that they've been doing in their lives, that they are now adopted here to help with that regulation piece. Um, and it works for them. So, the rumor gets around really quickly. Oh, we're doing this thing and it's helping us because it's keeping us on track and all these other things. So I think there's a piece of it that's there that is just the way in which students and young people, I don't want to, like I see Linda's online. I'm not even going to mention the digital natives thing. It's not about that. I think it's just the way that we all kind of communicate in different ways now, and that students have just adopted that and built that into their learning practices. But I also think that there is a component of this that's about course design and where the interface of that is. There's also a question in my mind about how much room we have to move with that. We still have to have census states to an extent. We still have to have, if we want to have a cohort experience, there are still certain structures that we're going to need to have in place that are going to come up against the way in which students want to learn. So it's a challenging one, but it's a good question, and that's why it's where we're going to go with that next.
So another question that came up in the chat, and again, ladies and gentlemen, if you've got a question, feel free to put your hand up. Otherwise, I'll continue to be your advocate. Michelle asked, Michelle asked another question, which actually leads into a question that I was asked, well, I was thinking about, which is, we're talking a lot about the mechanics of them, to use your analogy, understanding the trees, right? And us
Mm.
understanding the trees. Do you think maybe the students are, I guess my concern would be that they're getting maybe led a bit astray, that the commentary there, I think as academics, we love the idea of saying, for example, hey, they should be doing it on the LMS, because then we get the
Mm.
opportunity to sort of say, no, you're totally going the wrong way, and that we don't get to do that if they're on Instagram Messenger. So I guess Michelle said, how do we embed this sense of flexibility in a structured way? And I think what she's kind of suggesting is there a mechanism to teach them how to do this, train them how to do this in their own self-regulated learning?
Uh,
Is that the ultimate question though, Jason? Is that
it
Jason's
is.
ultimate?
It is. But and there's a big but here. And one of my PhD students is working on this now. So he's done a really thorough scan of what's out there to help students with this. As you can imagine, it's not easy. The solution is not to give them a 1 hour session on learning how to learn that is optional during O week, which I think has been the traditional way of, dealing with this. And most of our universities offer something along those lines. What it needs to be something that's longer and thinner and introduces students to ideas around how they might do a better job of making judgments about their progress and making good decisions. And preferably that would start way, way back. So we're working with our outreach people to start thinking about what this looks like in year 7, for example. Right. So we can start to instill in year 7s, some of the things that we have learned about, self-regulation and how we can help it. And some of the things that year 7s can engage with. So, for example, being confused doesn't mean that you're hopeless and can't do it. It actually is a signal to maybe try a different approach. We can start to seed those messages in earlier. Then by the time they're getting to us and then thinking about what it looks like beyond graduation, they've already got instilled in them a good set of practices about understanding how they learn themselves and then how they can progress that as they go forward. So the idea that you can do this in one snapshot in an hour during O week, it's not realistic. But more we can stretch out and get these messages consistent over time, I think the better it will become for students. And it's inconsistent between secondary and tertiary, as we know as well. That's problematic. A lot of secondary schools are still talking about growth mindset. We don't talk about that. So it's a different language that we use around a lot of these things, which is not helping either. But it's a good question. We're working on it, but it's a tough nut to crack because some of this is also transferable and some of it's not. So some things are really very discipline and kind of knowledge domain specific, and some of them are a bit more transferable. So the confusion one I think is a little more transferable. So if I get stuck on something and I'm confused, and I know that means I should try some different strategies, that's probably going to translate to other contexts to a degree, but other things will be very specific to a certain discipline or subject area. It's a tough one.
It is a tough one. It's a tough question to ask a psychologist,
Mm.
I think. The Healy is trying his best to, to cast a vision about
Yeah.
Queensland versus other states, and I'm not going to get into that at all. But he did ask earlier. This Matthew Hillier asked earlier about AI literacy. I guess and this is something I'm interested in too, as a computer scientist. How important do you think AI literacy is? do the students need to understand the trees in terms of the computer science, or is it enough for them to understand their learning? Am I stretching your analogy too far?
A little. Uh, I, okay, so here's something that caught my attention around this debate, and I think it was Dave Snowden that said this in one of the things that was on earlier in the year. Partly I'm saying this because I come from a faculty of humanities, arts, and social sciences. I would like to think that our development in all of this allows us to become more human and not more like machines. So if we go down the path of thinking about what AI literacy looks like, to me, that has got to be relative to the human. We live in a human world, and humans should be the first point of contact, which is why I like to think about this from a human computer interaction perspective, because you're taking all of it into account. Is there a role for AI literacy in this? Well, there needs to be. I mean, if people can't navigate some of the basic tools, as we're seeing already, there is a sense that we're going to get left behind. But how much of that is really about understanding the nuts and bolts of it? I don't pretend that I do. You know, I know conceptually how a neural network works, but there's no way I could ever make one. Do I need to? It's a question. I'm not sure we know the answer to that. I don't know the
Oh,
answer to that.
I think you did well. I think it is at those borders to me, and it's understanding what goes in and what comes out, and how a little bit about the mechanics of how that works, but not necessarily being able to debate at length on what a large language model is and
Yeah.
how it works. And I don't know enough about that myself. Um, so, any other burning questions, ladies and gentlemen? We've got just a couple of minutes left. I think I've harvested most of the interesting comments. Sorry, I shouldn't say it that way, should I? Most of the questions from the chat. Lots of interesting comments, but
Mm,
I can't see any other. Quality of course design. Interesting.
mm.
No, I can't
How are
see
we going to
anything
help everybody
else.
else? Well, yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah. Do you want to get? Do you want to comment on that one or?
No, I think most people have heard my rant on us having better systems for connecting up education and educational research around the country. Don't need to go there again, do I?
Well, I'm going to ask you one more controversial question, and you can certainly say to me, Mike, we're out of time. That's Are we? So I looked at that graph, right? I looked at the with the two humps, right? And
Yeah.
I thought to myself, and I've been thinking to myself more and more, and it's an unpopular opinion. Are we being too flexible for the students? And I kind of said it in the chat. And Matthew Hillier challenged that the way that the society is going, we probably need to be more flexible for the students. That was his response. Do we need to reduce that flexibility? Is that one way to adjust that graph? That's what I'm thinking about, the haves and the have-nots, that big dip
Mm.
in the middle. Or
It,
am I just being old-fashioned and a digital dinosaur?
uh, so I like to think about these sorts of things from a developmental perspective, right? So if you think about a 3-year-old, I have to think about 3-year-olds a lot. Uh, they need a lot of external regulation, right? Because otherwise they're going to be jumping off stuff and setting themselves on fire or whatever, right? Um, so they need a lot of external regulation. But by the time a student finishes university, they should be pretty well self-regulated to a degree. They shouldn't. So they talk about this idea of a cone in a can model, where at the beginning there's a lot of external regulation, but over time that gets taken away. So it's almost like scaffolding for self-regulation. And I could see a role for that, but I think the ultimate aim is that we want to get students at the end of a degree program, or even as soon as possible, to get to the point where they can manage this stuff themselves, so that they're not the equivalent of 3-year-olds in terms of self-regulated learning. We want them to be able to make those good decisions themselves. The quicker we can do that, the better. But ultimately, if they're going out of a university at the end of it and they haven't got these skills in place, I think we're probably doing them a disservice, because that's the kind of reality of fast, flexible kind of learning that we're moving into. Look at things like micro credentials. It sort of is pointing to this more flexibility, and trying to go against it, I think, is going against the tide. So how do we prepare students for that kind of world as quickly and efficiently as possible? As much as I don't like efficiency per se, I think it's critical to get them there when we can, so that they can make the most of the flexibility we can offer them.
So I'm gonna
That's my 2 cents.
Oh no, it's good 2 cents. Going to read what Penny wrote. And Justin a little bit earlier in the chat mentioned he had a little comment, right? He said, "Are these if these students are not being successful, are they really students?" And Penny said, "I want to think more about Justin's observation about identity and naming. Are
Mm,
students really students, and could that help our thinking?" So I guess she's pushing on the other end of that flexibility argument, right? Any
yeah.
final thoughts on that?
Oh, I think my internet's getting bad.
But it's not
Well,
working anymore.
that does open up a can of worms, because I think part of the broader conversation here is how we bring students in as partners into the
Mm,
process. Like, that has to be critical in all of this. It's not as though the whole story here is about us doing stuff to students. They need to be partners in both the way the university runs and in their learning. So that's I think that's really a complicated
mm,
mix of question, and I think we perhaps are too far one direction or the other over time. Um, yeah, that's also a very tricky one.
mm,
But
Well,
that's my way of saying I don't want to go there.
I don't go there. Yes, no, that's okay. That's awesome. I challenged you with a couple of tricky questions there at the end, but we are a couple of minutes over time, ladies and gentlemen. So I will just to finish by saying, oh well, there'll be employees instead. Maybe just leave that one.
Yikes.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you once again. Thank you so much for fielding all our difficult questions, Justin, and thank you everybody, Justin, Jason, and thank you everybody for all your questions. I really was just serving as an advocate for everybody else. Some great discussion there in the chat, Jason. So we'll give you another round of applause, which you can see is
Thank you.
happening. And apart from that, say thank you so much for your time. And ladies and gentlemen, for everybody that's still here, we will have another ASCILITE webinar in October, and you'll shortly see details about what that is. But apart from that, thanks so much, Jason, and thanks everybody. See you next
Thank
month.
you all. Thanks, Mike.